We're going to start with a passage in Deuteronomy 18, just to remind ourselves of Joshua's place in all of this. Deuteronomy 18. And we're going to begin reading in verse 8. Deuteronomy 18. And that can't possibly be right. Hang on a second. Verse 14. Chapter 18, verse 14. The nations you will dispossess. Listen to those who practice sorcery and divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. For this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, "Let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die." So you remember at the foot of the mountain, the people were so astonished, so scared by the presence of God on the mountain when he was trying to speak to them from the mountain, that they said, "We need to elect somebody to just go talk to you. We don't want to have this voice talk to us anymore." So God calls Moses up and he gives Moses the law. One of the things that does is further establish Moses as the voice of authority. If God speaks and everybody hears God speaking themselves, that's one category. If God gives all of his message to one man and that one man comes and gives that message, that's a different category. That guy becomes a lot more central. After they're in the wilderness for a while, if you remember, Miriam and Aaron have a little bit of an uprising against Moses, and they say, "Well, doesn't God speak to us as well?" And God's answer is, "I speak to everybody else in dreams or in visions, but I speak to Moses face to face." Right? He's in a completely different category. So for Joshua to be his replacement, to be the one that God was going to raise up from among the people, he has to have some of these qualifications. And so we've already had a couple of things that he did that set him apart as that prophet, as that leader. He led the people across the water of Jericho, right, at the Jordan River next to Jericho, at flood stage. He's won great victories over their enemies. And so here he's going to establish himself as the ultimate spiritual leader of Israel. In fact, when you get to the very end of Joshua, and we'll go over and read that speech here a little bit, he teaches the next generation that you need to follow what I've given you. So Moses leads the generation in the wilderness. He turns it over to Joshua and his generation. Joshua tells his generation that they've got to, teach the next generation so that all of this will be continuing. But something interesting happens in Joshua chapter 8. So go to chapter 8, verse 30. Joshua chapter 8, verse 30. And we'll see that Joshua becomes more established even than he already was as the spiritual leader of the people. Right? Verse 30. Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. On it they offered to the Lord burnt offerings and sacrificed fellowship offerings. Then, in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on stones a copy of the law of Moses. All the Israelites with their elders, officials, and judges were standing on both sides of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Both the foreigners living among them and the native-born were there. Half of the people stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had formerly commanded when he gave instructions on blessing the people in Israel. Afterwards, Joshua read all the words of the law. the blessings and the curses, just as it is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children, and the foreigners who were living among them. Right, so we've come up out of Egypt. We brought a few Egyptians with us. We come across, we've defeated some enemies on the way. Some of those are now living among us. We've defeated Jericho and picked up Rahab and her family. They're now living among us. So we have some foreigners who have become kind of part of the deal. But this is the next generation. So when Moses read the law to the people at Sinai, some of these people heard it, but only, Joshua and Caleb, right? They're the only ones that were there on that occasion. Everybody else died in the wilderness. So this generation comes out. They have a new leader, same law. So Joshua is going to recopy all of the law. All right, so now how many stone tablets have we had? This is the third set, right? So we had a set that got broken, a set to replace them, and now Joshua, he didn't get the opportunity for God to inscribe it personally. Joshua had to do all of the writing himself. This tells us a little bit more about Joshua. Joshua can read and write. All right, so that's kind of an important thing. Probably not all of the Israelites had that ability, but the leadership did. Joshua was able to read and write. Inscribes, copies down all of the things that Moses had said, and then reads it to them. Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim were close enough together that it kind of made an amphitheater. All right, so if you've got half the people over here and half the people over here, Joshua can read the law and they can hear the law, all gathered around the Ark of the Covenant. What's inside the Ark of the Covenant? The originals, right? The originals are inside the Ark. And now here's Joshua, who has made another copy, and he reads that copy to all of the people. So here he sets himself up as the spiritual leader. So he's been a leader of the people as far as physically getting them across Jordan. He's been a general for the people, winning battles for them. Now he sets himself up as the ultimate spiritual leader. But again, exactly the same information. Nothing has changed. Now, for those of us in churches of Christ and other groups that we would call restoration groups, this is an important idea, that even though you change generations and you change leadership, you don't change what God has told you to do. So in the late 1800s, there was a huge movement, still ongoing, to just go back to the New Testament and reestablish New Testament Christianity as it was in the first century. Kind of jump over Protestantism, jump over Catholicism, and try to reestablish what was it like to be a Christian in the first century. I think we've done some things very well in that regard, and some things remain to be worked on. I mean, we always need to be pushing toward being as much like the first century church as we possibly can be. So here's Joshua, and he says we want to be exactly who Moses called us to be while we were still in the desert. Even though we've moved into a new homeland, we've conquered some people, we're spreading out in the land that God's given us, we need to keep the same list of laws. All right. Now, before we move on, run over to Joshua 24. This one should be familiar to you, I think. Joshua's last great speech. Joshua 24. Where do we want to start? 14. 24:14. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. If serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Right? So we're familiar with that passage. This is Joshua just before his death telling the next generation, it's your turn. right? So Moses gave it to me, I gave it to you, you keep it going. We're going to keep the same set of laws that were kept previously. Now, at the end of Joshua, you're kind of in the preamble to the book of Judges. When you get to the book of Judges, unfortunately, the next few generations don't do a very good job of keeping the law. And so God sends in people to persecute them, and they have to call for help. God sends judges to help them, and we're going to be there in the next couple of weeks. We'll move over into the book of Judges. But without the leadership of Moses and Joshua, things began to disintegrate within a short period of time. Right? So all of this is wonderful, but Israel still has a flaw in their fabric, and that flaw is that sometimes when they feel secure, they don't ask God's opinion. They just act. And it seems like the right thing to do at the time. Think back to Ai. The spies go and check out Ai. They come back and tell Joshua, we don't need to take the whole army. It's a small town. We'll whoop them without any problem. We'll just take a couple of thousand and we'll go finish these guys off. They didn't ask God's opinion. God could have told them, right? You've got sin in the camp. It's going to be a disaster. So they go, they lose terribly. 36 men are killed from the army. Then they come back, and ask, well, why in the world is this the case? Then Joshua goes before God and says, why did you bring us across the Jordan just to let us get killed over here? All right, so we have that weaponized whining that they did so well as a result of not asking God first. Well, that's going to happen again. Joshua chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. When all the kings west of the Jordan heard about these things, the kings in the hill country, in the western foothills, and along the entire coast of the Mediterranean Sea as far as Lebanon, the kings of the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They all came together to wage war against Joshua and Israel. So all of these folks had been infighting for centuries. But when the Israelites show up, they all had a common enemy and they were willing to come together. However, when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They went in a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins that had been cracked and mended. They put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothing. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. When they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, we've come from a distant country. Please make a treaty with us. The Israelites said to the Hivites, but perhaps you live near us. How can we make a treaty with you? They said, no, we're your servants. Joshua asked, who are you and where did you come from? And they answered, your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. We heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon the king of Heshbon and Og the king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. Our elders and all those living in our country said to us, take provisions for your journey, go and meet them and say to them, we are your servants, make a treaty with us. This bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you, but now see how dry and moldy it is. These wineskins that we filled were brand new, but see how cracked they are. Our clothes and sandals are worn out because of our very long journey. Now notice verse 14. The Israelites sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. Now, if you don't know that there's a problem coming, you haven't been reading the Old Testament long enough, right? Hang around. When it says they did not inquire of the Lord, something bad's about to happen. Now, it's not going to be as bad as it could be in the beginning, right? It's not like the Gibeonites are a strong force and are going to suddenly overcome them and defeat them. But they're going to infiltrate them, right? This is the first time that we're just going to allow a group of people to live. Now the Gibeonites knew that there was a death sentence on all of the people that were living in their country. Look over at verse 24. They answered Joshua, "Your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and to wipe out all of its inhabitants from before you. So we feared for our lives because of you. That's why we did this. So now we're in your hands. Do with us whatever seems good and right to you." So they find out about the lie too late. And because they're honorable people, they're God's people, they're not willing to just go ahead and wipe these folks out. They've made a treaty with them. All of Israel said, "We're not going to kill you. We're going to make a treaty with you." So Joshua then puts them under servitude. They were to be the servants of Israel from that time on, and they were. But what happens when you bring in a whole culture that's not your culture and they start to be your servants? Do they leave all their gods behind? No. Do they stop talking about their divinations? No. Some of your servants are people who are diviners. Some of your servants are people who talk to the dead. Some of your servants are the folks that God told you to get rid of when you come into this country. But you didn't ask God's opinion. You just made a treaty with them. And now you've got them living among you. This is the first time that we really see a breach in that whole segment. What's going to happen eventually, after a few more well-fought, well-won battles, the Israelites get tired of it. Right? They win a lot of great battles, and then they go home. Right? They want to be with their families. And so those that followed them from the east side of the Jordan go back to their lands. The newly won lands are divvied up according to God's plan, and they settle in. And there are a lot of people that are still living in those places. And so they began to intermarry. They began to culturalize, to be connected to this new culture that they've invaded. And as time goes by, the culture begins to win. You don't have Moses with all the people together in the desert. You don't have Joshua with all the people together on the west side of the Jordan. The people begin to disperse. And as the people disperse, it's up to their local groups, up to the heads of the clans, it's up to the heads of the tribes to make these decisions. And so instead of one big nation, you have 12 or 13 different groups who are all kind of self-governing after they get into the promised land. There's no central government in the beginning of the occupation. And so once Joshua's dead, once they spread out, then God's edict to go in there and clean the place out begins to fall on deaf ears. It gets less and less important to them, and they assimilate into the culture. For us, all these centuries later, there's a little bit, and I don't know how far to push the issue, but there's a little bit of a lesson to be won or to be taught. If you are dedicated to Christian culture and to keeping other people away from family and from influencing your family, that's one thing. But more and more professing Christians are just part of the community. We've become assimilationists. We've just become part of everything else. And so we are well influenced by the culture that's around us. Now, there are some things in our culture that really don't make hill of beans one way or the other. And they don't hurt us as Christians. But Christians need to be well enough informed as to the will of God, right? Joshua gets them all together. He reads them the law. He gets ready to die, and he says, this was the law. I followed God. You follow God. He continues to push that with each generation. At some point, Christians are going to have to reclaim our family groups in light of the culture and make sure that our children and our grandchildren are better prepared to understand the difference between being a Christian and just being a part of the popular culture. And sometimes the differences are glaring. Sometimes the differences are so big that we ought to be able to see them immediately and respond to them immediately. There are some Christians who should be ashamed at the way they behave more as a part of the culture than as a part of Christ's body. Step up on the soapbox for just a second. One of the things that has happened to us is that 75 years ago, 100 years ago, we saw ourselves as a nation, as a Christian nation. And so the kinds of principles that Christians held dear were fairly widely held in the culture. Imagine that at the time of Joshua, right? The law was the law. People were very unified, and they followed the culture of God's law. As time went by and they became less connected to the nation or to the big picture, they became more and more connected to local culture and to local tradition. And as a result, they moved farther and farther away. Beginning in the late 50s, early 60s in our country, there was a movement away from religion in general, Christianity in particular, so that one of the ways that we refer to the current era is the post-Christian era in the United States. So to say that we are the Christian nation now, I think is a misnomer. I don't think that that's who we are. I think there are a lot of Christians that live in the United States. I think that the majority of people who would claim a religion still claim Christianity, but I think that the culture has so infiltrated the ranks of the Christians that sometimes it's awfully hard to tell the difference between someone who is non-Christian and part of the culture and someone who's Christian and part of the culture. So again, that's something that Joshua was trying to avert late in his life, something that you and I are trying to avert as we get later in our lives, that our younger generations need to think clearly about how much of the culture can you let into the church before the church isn't the church anymore. I think when I was a child, our question was, how much of the church can we get into the culture? Now the question is, how much of the culture can we allow to be in the church before the church just ceases to be the church? So it's a good question. It's worth asking. I don't know the answer to the question, but I think it's an important question that each of us in our family groups need to contemplate. So anyway, I will leave all of that with you. And I think, Lord willing, we'll look at one more thing from the life of Joshua, because there's an amazing, miraculous thing that happens in one of his battles that is worthy of our time and attention next week. And then, Lord willing, we'll move on into the book of Judges, which has just some wild and wonderful stories that we can enjoy. But if you need to respond to the invitation tonight, we'd love to help you any way we can as we stand and sing.